Welcome and good evening, everyone, to another webinar hosted by the Australian Peace and Security Forum, the APSF. My name is Penny Sackett, and I'm a board member of the APSF. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the first Australians. I speak to you today from the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and I want to thank our Aboriginal friends for their wisdom, their culture, and their stewardship of country. And I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. The APSF is a not-for-profit network of informed researchers and professionals working to strengthen peace and security for all Australians by providing information, analysis, and opportunities for dialogue with government and civil society. We maintain that true comprehensive peace and security rests on a number of pillars that include health and human security, economic and technological security, and a diverse environment and stable climate. Today, however, our speakers will address a pillar that rests on the capabilities, mission, and deployment of the military as it relates to AUKUS, the Australia-USA UK Leaders' Statement that has seen Australia agree to purchase nuclear-powered submarines at a total cost of up to $368 billion over 30 years. And the first down payment of $800 million was handed over to the US by Defense Minister Marles last week. Our three speakers will each briefly address AUKUS from their own different perspectives and then be available to field questions after all have spoken. So please post your questions in the chat, which is being monitored. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available later on the APSF website. Our first speaker is the Honorable Melissa Parke, who was appointed as the Executive Director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, known as ICAN, on 1 September 2023. Ms. Parke is a former Australian Minister for International Development and former Australian Federal Member of Parliament from 2007 to 2016. Prior to being elected to the Australian Parliament, Ms. Parke worked as an international lawyer with the United Nations in Kosovo, Gaza, New York, and Lebanon. More recently, Ms. Parke served as a member of the UN group of eminent experts on Yemen, mandated to investigate violations of human rights and humanitarian law during the conflict in Yemen. This evening, she speaks to us on the prospects of nuclear war, its risks and consequences, as well as the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and the Australian government's position on the treaty and nuclear deterrence. Melissa, I hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, Penny. Hello, everyone. It is so good to be with kindred spirits at times like these. I acknowledge the Indigenous owners of the lands in Australia and elsewhere who have been the primary victims of nuclear weapons development and testing around the world. And I'll come to AUKUS shortly, but first, Albert Einstein was once asked, what would be the weapons of World War III? He said he didn't know, but that the weapons of World War IV would be sticks and stones. Human beings have created a weapon that has the capacity to destroy all complex life on Earth. Indeed, the latest science, as reported in the Nature Food Journal in 2022, confirms that even a limited nuclear war using only a small fraction of the world's nuclear arsenal would cause global climate disruption. From firestorms that would send enormous amounts of soot into the stratosphere, circling the globe, blocking out sunlight, leading to agricultural collapse and the death by starvation of more than 2 billion people in a nuclear winter. A major nuclear war, say between the US and Russia, would mean the end of human civilization and most other life forms. So nuclear weapons are an issue for the collective security of humanity and the planet and should not be dealt with as the national security prerogative of a select few countries. The only other global policy issue remotely comparable in terms of its impact on planetary survivability is the environment crisis. but nuclear bombs will kill us and the environment a lot faster. And so long as any nuclear weapons remain anywhere, they are bound one day to be used, if not by design, then by mistake or miscalculation. You've probably all heard of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, that's just one of a list of nuclear near misses and accidents where the world could have ended. Chatham House released a report in 2014 documenting 13 such instances. And as noted by many experts, including the former co-chair of the International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, Gareth Evans, the fact we have survived so long without a nuclear catastrophe is not due to good management, but rather sheer dumb luck. And we cannot expect that luck to continue indefinitely. The UN Secretary General has said when it comes to nuclear weapons, luck is not a strategy. Even US President Ronald Reagan said nuclear weapons are totally irrational, totally inhumane, good for nothing but killing, and possibly destructive of life on Earth, which is why he and President Gorbachev agreed in the late 1980s to massively reduce the number of nuclear weapons on the planet and almost agreed to eliminate them altogether. Well, it is time to finish the job. The 2024 Nobel Peace Prize winners Nihon Hidankyo, the survivors of the US atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, have courageously retold and relived their childhood trauma again and again in the hope that the world will listen to their message about the danger of nuclear weapons and the urgent need for disarmament. Such powerful testimonies, combined with the ongoing failure of the nuclear armed states to abide by their legal obligations to disarm under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, led to a growing sense of injustice concerning the nuclear status quo, eventually resulting in 122 countries coming together in the UN General Assembly in 2017 to adopt the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or TPNW. And this treaty is a game changer in nuclear disarmament, which had been stalled for decades. The TPNW comprehensively prohibits nuclear weapons and builds on Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty by providing a pathway under international law for nuclear armed states to disarm in a time-bound, verifiable manner. The TPNW is also the first multilateral treaty to provide for victim assistance and environmental remediation for communities impacted by nuclear weapons use and testing, as well as a scientific advisory group and agenda stream. So the TPNW is not only a disarmament treaty, but also a human rights and environment and a feminist treaty. It's an investment in international law and multilateralism at a time when these things are increasingly under threat. And it is democratising the nuclear weapons debate, taking it out of the hands of the UN Security Council Permanent Five, all nuclear armed states, and bringing it into the General Assembly where every country has an equal vote. The nuclear armed states and their allies often try to portray the TPNW as a soft humanitarian approach that is not based on real security. But the reality is the reverse. Looking at humanitarian and environmental consequences is very much security. The wholesale destruction of infrastructure, the environment, the economy, millions of people dying of blast, burns and radiation, and billions dying of starvation in a nuclear winter is very much security. The more important question is how sustainable is a security approach based on nuclear weapons, any use of which would be not only genocidal, but also suicidal. Half the countries of the world have already joined the TPNW, but not so far Australia, although the Labor government has sent an observer to the 2 meetings of the states parties of the treaty. And we hope it will send an observer to the forthcoming 3rd meeting of states parties in New York in early March. So what is Australia's position on the TPNW? Well, back in December 2018, in an impassioned speech at the Labor Party's National Conference in Adelaide, Anthony Albanese, whose political mentor was Tom Uren, who'd witnessed the atomic bombing of Nagasaki as a prisoner of war, described nuclear weapons as the most destructive, inhumane and indiscriminate weapons ever created. Referencing the party's long history of action on disarmament, he urged delegates to support a motion that would commit a future Labor government to signing and ratifying the TPNW. The motion was adopted with unanimous support and resounding applause. It was reaffirmed at subsequent national conferences. 6 years later, Albanese is Prime Minister and the TPNW is part of international law. Many of Australia's neighbours, including New Zealand, Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand, Fiji, Solomon Islands, Timor-Leste, and most recently Indonesia, are among its states parties, but we are still not on board. The principal impediment to Australia joining the TPNW is our reliance in our defence policy on America's so-called nuclear umbrella. This dangerous and absurd concept, dangerous because it makes Australia a nuclear target, and absurd because the US would never sacrifice one of its own cities for ours, has severely restrained Australia's advocacy for a nuclear weapons-free world. How can we credibly argue that nuclear weapons must be eliminated while asserting in the same breath that they guarantee our security and prosperity? And even believing nuclear weapons provide security is dangerous. If true, why wouldn't all non-nuclear nations arm themselves? The paradox is that nuclear states see their weapons as protective, yet expect others not to pursue them. And as Gareth Evans has argued, keeping nuclear stockpiles, even if you don't intend to use them except by way of retaliation, is not a risk-free enterprise. The deterrent utility of nuclear weapons is illusory, and the risk of retaining nuclear weapons outweighs any conceivable benefit from them. The more that nuclear-armed states and their allies insist that nuclear weapons are essential for their security, the more other countries will want them, thus encouraging proliferation. And we are seeing the rapid escalation of nuclear risk on the Korean Peninsula and in the Middle East, and a number of countries starting to speculate publicly about potentially acquiring nuclear weapons themselves, including South Korea, Saudi Arabia, and even some European leaders. The AUKUS military partnership between Australia, the UK and the US has further diminished Australia's credibility as a non-proliferation advocate. Under AUKUS, Australia hopes to acquire conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarines to be fueled with highly enriched uranium, the essential ingredient for nuclear bombs. This poses a major challenge for the non-proliferation regime, since it is the first time a nuclear-armed state will provide weapons-grade material to a non-nuclear weapon state, and could set a dangerous precedent for others to follow. Neighbouring countries have understandably responded with alarm and anger at the prospect of the greater nuclearisation of our region. If the planned acquisition occurs, and there are serious doubts as to whether it will, it would be all the more imperative for Australia to join the TPNW, as this would provide additional guardrails against nuclear weapons, applicable to the current government and, given that there's an election coming up, future governments. The TPNW prohibits a broader range of activities than the NPT and the Rarotonga Treaty, the 1985 South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone, to which Australia is already a state party. A different path for Australia is possible and necessary, a path that prioritises investments in peace and diplomacy over weapons and war, and avoids further harm to people and the environment. To become a champion of nuclear disarmament, as Australia has long claimed to be, we must end our complicity in the perpetuation of global nuclear dangers. The most obvious first step would be to act upon Labor's promise of signing and ratifying the TPNW. As part of this, Australia would have to remove our stated reliance on the US nuclear umbrella from our defence policy. And to the extent that Pine Gap, the US military and intelligence facility near Alice Springs, plays a role in US nuclear command and control, that would also need to end. In addition to providing a legal framework for the verified elimination of nuclear weapons, the TPNW includes novel provisions for assisting communities harmed by nuclear weapons use and testing. And in this regard, it is of particular importance to military veterans and to Indigenous Australians who still live with the toxic legacy of the British tests conducted on our soil, and to our neighbours in the Pacific, where more than 300 US British tests carried out. Australia joining the TPNW would also help to alleviate serious concerns that Australia has through AUKUS and other agreements relinquished its independence in foreign and defence policy to the US. These concerns have only increased now that Donald Trump has resumed the presidency, and the next 4 years promise to be a period of heightened chaos and unpredictability. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist just 2 weeks ago moved the hands of the doomsday clock forward to 89 seconds to midnight, the closest we've ever been to global catastrophe. Nuclear weapons are not part of the natural world that we are doomed to suffer. We do have a choice. We can choose to eliminate the existential threat by eliminating nuclear weapons. And of all the global challenges we face, this is the least complex. Humans built nuclear weapons and humans can dismantle them. All it requires is political will and leadership. And so far, it is civil society and TPNW member states who are showing that leadership. And we in ICAN look forward to Australia showing the same leadership and doing it in the near future. To borrow a phrase from Martin Luther King Jr., who often made the connection between the Black freedom struggle and the need for nuclear disarmament, we are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. This is no time for apathy or complacency. This is a time for vigorous and positive action. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. That was very powerful and eloquent, and a great reminder that Australia could actually be and set a precedent for the future that is looking more and more dangerous. Let's hope the precedent that it sets is one that makes us all safer. Thank you very much. I remind people that to put your questions in the chat that you may have for Melissa. Thank you very much, Melissa. Our second speaker is Allan Behm, who currently serves as Special Advisor on International Political Affairs at the Australia Institute in Canberra. During a long public service career, he was at various times responsible for national security policy, managing Australia's international strategic interests, and negotiating defense and security policy, as well as defense and security arrangements. He was subsequently Chief of Staff to the Minister for Climate Change and Industry from 2009 to 2013, and a Senior Advisor to the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs from 2017 to 2019. He has a significant publishing record and is a respected commentator in both the electronic and print media. Tonight, Allan will discuss the regional consequences, particularly in Asia, of Australia's AUKUS ambition and how it affects Australia's strategic relevance, independence, and sovereignty. Allan, I ask you to take it away.
Well, Professor Sackett, thank you very much, and hello to everybody. Last week, I was locked in an entertaining conversation with one of the silks at the Sydney bar about the difference between mendacity and subterfuge. AUKUS is built around both of those things. And that's why, as an exercise in public policy, it is such a dangerous and, in most respects, unprecedented statement of Australia's strategic and foreign policy ambition. So I'd like to unpack that just a little bit. Subterfuge actually is a legitimate tool of statecraft. It's simply that you don't have to reveal everything that you are aiming to achieve in order to begin achieving them. Mendacity, however, is an altogether different tool of statecraft because mendacity ultimately will bring you down. And that's the big worry that all of us who think about our national security over the long term are principally worried about. What are the mid to long-term consequences of a policy which is actually designed to deceive, but most of all, it actually deceives ourselves. If you think about where AUKUS came from, it began life as a kind of a wish on the part of people who actually are not responsible for national security policy, and certainly not responsible for the planning that goes in behind the development of national defence capability. AUKUS had its antecedents in people sitting around in the intelligence community fretting about the threat that they imagine is directed towards Australia from China. They've all talked themselves into that threat, and it is a matter of intelligence belief in Australia at this point. And I would remind everybody who has had a look into the nature of belief that it is essentially an assertion of fact, but without any evidence whatsoever. That's the nature of belief. And there's nothing wrong with belief, it's a legitimate human thing. But when you base your public policy on belief rather than fact, you're in deep trouble. And AUKUS is already in deep trouble. Let me touch first of all on the domestic aspects of AUKUS, about which I think you're all fully informed, but it's important to understand what self-deception looks like. We're embarking upon what would certainly be the biggest defence acquisition in Australia's history, for which we have no present capacity, we have none of the workforce skills, we have none of the engineering and design skills, we have none of the operational skills. So to acquire these castles in Spain, if I can be a little bit dismissive of the Spanish, to acquire these castles in Spain really requires an act of supreme faith, not only in our ability to receive them, but in the ability of Britain and the United States to deliver them. Neither Britain nor the United States at this point, 2025, are actually capable of designing or delivering a next generation submarine. By way of illustration, I might point out that the Collins-class submarine that we already occupy and have in operation, though we haven't looked after it too well, so I think only one can go to sea at the moment out of the 6. But we began that project in the late 80s and completed it in the beginning of the 2000s. We had 6 vessels, and it was actually a pretty successful program, notwithstanding the bad news that was created politically around it at the time. But that bad news was designed to bring down Kim Beazley rather than really to put an end to the program. The British submarine that is currently still under construction, 8 of those were designed. It began at about the same time as the Collins class, and that program here in 2025 has not ended yet. The final keel, not that they have keels, but the final construction was begun only last year, and it will be several years before that fleet of 8 submarines will be delivered over a time span exceeding 40 years. And the American Virginia-class program, that hasn't completed yet either. In order to reach its program end, it requires a build rate of a bit over 2 per year. The current build rate is 1 a year, and already there are about a dozen of the Virginia-class submarines awaiting repair and maintenance with naval construction yards, which are simply incapable of both finishing the build and repairing the ones they've already got. So if you believe that you are going to acquire Virginia-class submarines in Australia anytime over the next 30 to 40 years, it is a real leap of faith. Nonetheless, that leap of faith we're prepared to back up in hard cash without any guarantee that we'll get anything for it, as Minister Miles handed over in Washington last week. $800 million is a lot to pay for nothing, I think, and I'm sure that the American shipyards will much appreciate Australia's generosity. The duplicity from Britain and the United States, in my opinion, is extraordinary. The Brits are in no position to design a new class of submarine at this point, and will desperately need American assistance for that. And the protocols are not yet in place to do that. And a new class of American submarines to follow on from Virginia, they're in the mind's eye at this point. So here we have an extended version of blind faith. I want to touch now on the regional aspects of it, because this is where duplicity really does have a big price. Already, two of our regional neighbours have come out and said that they think this is a very bad idea. Indonesia and Malaysia were very quick off the mark to say this is a massive overreach. It is, in their view, quite a legitimate thing for Australia to operate submarines, but not the sorts of submarines that we're proposing to acquire, because those submarines are actually designed not to defend Australia, but actually to sink nuclear ballistic missile submarines of a potential adversary. That's what they're designed to do. They're a highly offensive weapon to operate against submarines that have a low probability of ever being used by anyone, and I include China here, in a direct threat against Australia, unless we do things that make the use of ballistic missile submarines attractive to an adversary. And directly and obliquely, Melissa touched on some of those. That is, the ways in which we go about making ourselves a nuclear target as distinct from a military target. Other countries in the region have not been quite so forthright, but in my own contacts with regional think tanks, I know that the Singaporeans think that we're simply daft. They have no idea why we would get 10,000-ton submarines when all we need actually for our own defence are the more modest submarines, which are much more versatile actually, coming in at just around 4,000 tonnes. These submarines that we're talking about are effectively the size of surface ships. They're very big. And as technology unfolds, we are already looking now at space-based AI with supercomputing to be able to look, for example, at minute changes in ocean temperatures. These things will not be undetectable over the next 50 years. Sonically and thermally, the new submarines that we might acquire will progressively become sitting ducks, moving slowly on top of the water or underneath it. And that, again, is something which our regional neighbours think is a very peculiar thing for us to do. Japan, which you might imagine would have a bit more sympathy with Australia's plan, also thinks that we're daft, because the management of ballistic missile submarines has always been the business of the nuclear weapon states, and that's for extremely good reason. They're the ones who own and control ballistic missile submarines. And for Australia to get into the business of operating well north of the equator, in fact, in the same latitude as the Tropic of Cancer, which is a long, long way from the focal points that come in on the west and east of the Australian mainland. So the Japanese think tanks also think that we're having a very, very big lend of ourselves. In September last year, I visited Washington, mostly to promote the book I wrote last year about the odd couple, Australia and America, and it's quite a pro-American book. I'm quite a pro-American person. That's not to say I'm pro-stupidity, but America is a big, complex country, and it is in many respects similar to us, and we should be a friend of the United States. Not a slave, not a servile amanuensis, not an epigon, as I like to call it. We need to be a friend of the United States, which means exercising our sovereignty in our interest, where it converges with the interests of the United States, not giving up our sovereignty when it's in the interests of the United States to have us simply as a cipher. And that, unfortunately, is what we're inviting ourselves, this is our own stupidity, to do with the AUKUS submarines. Australia will not have the capacity to certify those submarines to go to sea. That will be the prerogative of the United States Navy, because it is the only Navy that can certify them to go to sea. So even to operate them requires the agreement and, in that sense, the permission of the United States. Nor will we be able actually to operate them on our own. We're proudly announcing that we're producing 2 nuclear qualified submariners per year. There are 15 of them on each of the Virginia-class submarines. And we would have an enormous task to produce the number of nuclear qualified submariners in the timeframes that we're talking about. It's simply beyond our gift. So that too will require our ceding sovereignty to the United States in command of our own vessels. And when we raise this with the Royal Australian Navy, we're simply told that we're wrong, and yet the facts, such as we can establish them, and remember, we haven't had much in the way of policy statement about these things, the facts, so far as we're able to establish them, indicate that we will never be able to exercise our own sovereignty with respect to those submarines. The final point I'd like to make, Penny, before closing and handing it over to everybody else, is to say that we do have long-term regional defence interests, which are best met by defence, cooperation and collaboration with our neighbours, and really active, engaged diplomacy with our neighbours to ensure that we work always in parallel and as a collective. I'm well able to argue that China creates many, many strategic risks for Australia, for our region, and for the rest of the world. I'm equally well able to argue that at this point, we do not have the evidence that China is a threat to us or to anyone else. It's not even a threat to the United States. So at this point, we would be much better advised to roll with the facts of submarines, the facts of submarine construction, and move to what we might want to call Plan A. That is, how do we actually have submarines? We've had them in the force structure previously. We had British submarines and then Australian-built submarines. It would be difficult for us to get back to Plan A, but that is within our capability grasp, and it is within the tradition of our defence and our strategic policy. AUKUS, I'm afraid, is not. Thank you.
Thank you, Allan. Thank you for clearing up the subterfuge and calling out the duplicity. I was particularly taken by your point that these submarines could make Australia not just a military target, but a nuclear target. Before I introduce our third speaker, I just wanted to say that evidently we have 120 people in our audience. And so we'd like to thank all of you for joining us, and we are monitoring those questions that you're putting in the chat. Now, our third speaker tonight is Major General Michael Smith, who for 34 years served in the Australian Defence Force, including numerous command and senior staff positions in Papua New Guinea, Cambodia, and Timor-Leste. His civilian career included CEO of AusCare, founding executive director of the Australian Civil Military Centre, and service with the United Nations in Libya, Myanmar, Nepal, and Yemen. Mike is the development advisor for Kaleo Indigenous Community Fund, chair of the Gallipoli Scholarship Fund, and a non-executive director of the Institute for Economics and Peace, as well as the Australian Respiratory Council. He is a past national president of the United Nations Association of Australia. Mike will discuss how AUKUS affects Australia's relationship to China and Australia's military strategy, the so-called deterrence through denial. Mike, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Penny. And thank you, Allan, and thank you, Melissa. Been absolutely great hearing your presentations. Well, greetings from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country in Canberra, and I would like to add my respects to the traditional custodians of the lands, seas and waterways. I must say that the latest statistics on closing the gap are really shameful, and our nation will not be complete unless and until we bridge this gap. So, will AUKUS make us safer? Well, in a word, no. And that's a real worry for our future security. In this short presentation, I'm just going to leave you with 5 key and interrelated takeaways for you to consider. And they should be on the slide here now, which I think you've got. Thanks, Catherine. And I'll very briefly address each of these points in turn. So first, AUKUS jeopardises our security both strategically and operationally. Strategically, AUKUS degrades our sovereignty, curtails our independence of action and fuels an arms race in our region. This is exactly what we do not want, and more so at the eye-watering financial and opportunity costs that AUKUS presents us. Importantly, there is absolutely no guarantee that we will procure our 8 submarines on time and on budget, if at all. And this makes AUKUS a very bad business venture at exorbitant cost. The head of AUKUS project has described recently that the AUKUS challenge as being greater than the Snowy Mountains hydroelectric scheme, which is hardly good odds for assuring our national security and survival. Now, the storage of high uranium waste remains unresolved for future generations, and accordingly, AUKUS should not proceed without early resolution of this critical issue. Now, it's important to recognise that the global balance of power has already shifted. China is now the major power in Asia. We mightn't like that, but that's a fact. Accordingly, Australia must chart a new course in a complex, multipolar world where the US is no longer the sole superpower. The US cannot guarantee our security, and the United Kingdom has been irrelevant to our security since the fall of Singapore in World War II. So strategically, there is no meaningful security from the AUKUS agreement. Under AUKUS, our submarines will become part of the US's flawed strategy to contain China, a strategy that they and we cannot possibly win. Some Australians might refute this, but the perception of China and other regional countries is and will remain that Australia's commitment to the Anglosphere and our priority to be the US's deputy sheriff down under. And in such circumstances, perception is reality. At all costs, we must avoid becoming involved in a military contest between the US and China. But AUKUS actually increases this likelihood, which could result in direct military strikes against Australia and devastation if nuclear deterrence fails. Our choice should not be between prosperity from China as our major trading partner or security from the US. Like other countries in our region, we need to grow up and manage our international relationships, hedge our bets, ensure our independence, and invest in a coherent and achievable national security strategy. Now, what about operationally? And Allan's covered some of this already. AUKUS, importantly, unbalances our defence force and it further embeds us in future wars conducted by the United States, whether we like it or not. Defence has previously contended that a minimum of 12 submarines are required to maintain an effective two-ocean presence, but in best case, AUKUS only provides 8. Expert submariners have advised that it will not be possible to crew and service 3 different classes of AUKUS submarines as is currently planned. So we'll have the Virginia class, then we'll have the British class, and then we'll have our own homegrown Australian AUKUS. 3 different beasts. They might all be done under AUKUS, but it's going to be very difficult for us. Impossible, I would say. Now, Australian submarines can possibly be Australian flagged, commanded and crewed up to a point, but they will operate always under the US command and control system. Now, this is a retrograde step that in some sense returns us to the time when the RAN served as part of the Royal Navy. I thought we'd grown up. Submarines may not be totally obsolete by the time Australia finally commissions HMAS AUKUS, but advances in technology, particularly in autonomous robotics and underwater detection, will almost certainly render them obsolescent. Now, my second point relates to China. There can be little doubt that AUKUS was predicated on this unsubstantiated assertion that China may threaten Australia and jeopardise the so-called rules-based international order. But there is little evidence to support this assertion. China has certainly modernised and expanded its defence force. Short of mutual nuclear annihilation, no adversary could now defeat China on its territory or in its immediate region. China's security is assured. With its increased military capability, China has become more assertive in its immediate region, particularly in relation to Taiwan and its claims in the South China Sea. History suggests that we should expect this of great powers. It's rather normal. But China has not threatened other countries and, unlike the United States, it is a signatory to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS. It is committed to freedom of navigation, on which its trade, including with Australia, depends. China is already a major power in Asia, and if not so already, it is destined to become the world's leading economy well before the AUKUS timetable reaches maturity. But China is not and has never been a hegemonic power. China does not have numerous military bases abroad, and since the Korean War has not been involved in major and protracted conflicts. A very short one with Vietnam and of a few weeks and some skirmishes with India on the border. Australia needs to strengthen relations with China, on which our future prosperity depends. This does not mean subordinating our national interests or again becoming too economically dependent on China, but respecting China as the great power it now is. Rather than contesting and competing with China in the South Pacific, we should welcome China's economic assistance to help develop these countries in accordance with each country's priorities. This is good development practice, actually. We should seek China's agreement for this region to remain a nuclear-free and non-militarised zone. Now, my third point focuses on the need to urgently recalibrate our alliance with the United States. Personally, and like Allan, I'm actually very pro-American. But AUKUS, AUSMIN, that is the talks that we have, Australian ministerial talks, and more importantly, the force posture initiatives, has transformed the original intention of the ANZUS agreement. we have now gone well beyond an agreement to consult on security matters. In our quest to be protected by the United States, and despite the lack of any major threat to our country, we have allowed ourselves to be colonised by Uncle Sam. Far from assuring our security, US military installations in Australia and those to come under AUKUS will be directly targeted should war occur. And in the event of nuclear attack, it is all over Red Rover. Yet the details of these bases and their consequent risks to our security have not been shared with the Australian public. Now, perhaps because of our fear of abandonment, as Allan used to say, we have too willingly committed military forces to failed wars with the United States, based on inadequate strategic legitimacy and unachievable ends. We have been camp followers to US military and political failures in Vietnam and Afghanistan, and to an illegal invasion of Iraq that resulted in regional mayhem. In Afghanistan, the reputation of our elite special forces was unnecessarily tarnished, and the Royal Commission's findings into deaths by suicide revealed the enormous tragedy to veterans and their families from engaging in these useless wars. And can anyone explain how Australian ships firing missiles into Houthi strongholds in Yemen adds to Australia's security? We urgently need to recalibrate our commitment to the US alliance. Strategically, we can encourage the United States not to go with war with China and to share power sensibly with them. Our primary contribution to the alliance should continue to be the maintenance of peace in the Southwest Pacific. That's about as much as we can do. And leading by example, we can encourage the Americans to re-engage in UN peacekeeping. Indeed, as we should do as an example to them. My fourth point is that our defence strategy of deterrence through denial is both dangerous and unachievable. We need to rethink it. There can be little doubt that our Defence Department has been captured by the Pentagon. I recall the wise motto of the Royal Military College, where I spent 4 formative years. That motto was, or it still is, I hope, Doctrina Vim Promovit. Learning promotes strength. But I think we have learnt very little. And we're certainly not stronger because of AUKUS. Nuclear deterrence has some relevance in its madness because of mutually assured destruction. But as Melissa said, this ain't a good strategy either. But there is little, if any, historical evidence, concrete evidence, that conventional deterrence has ever worked. Too frequently, it results in an arms race that leads to war. And when armed to the teeth, opportunities need to be found to test the latest technology. The so-called war on terror, in which Australia too willingly followed the United States, provides a recent example of this. The procurement of weapons systems can never deter an opponent, and so it is with AUKUS. As for denial, it is not at all clear what it is that our defence strategy is denying. In essence, deterrence and denial are nice words without practical meaning. Our defence strategy must support and not lead a comprehensive national security strategy. But unfortunately, Australia doesn't currently have this. Our defence strategy must be achievable. We will require a strong independent and balanced Australian Defence Force, focused on a non-threatening posture of defence in depth, backed by demonstrable national resilience, a strong economy, and detailed mobilisation planning. So for all these 4 reasons, the Australian Peace and Security Forum believes that our government must review the AUKUS agreement and consider other and more cost-effective options. A public review of AUKUS will provide Australians an opportunity to understand the choices we face and the costs and benefits of the various options. And this leads me to my final and I think most important point. The Australian Peace and Security Forum has written to the Prime Minister and leaders of all major parties and to most current parliamentarians, requesting them to work collaboratively with the Australian people in the next term of government to prepare a comprehensive Australian Peace and Security Strategy, APSS. Given that our personal and collective security is, or should be, the most important responsibility for all our elected representatives, please consider this when you cast your vote at our next federal election, which is not far away. This slide shows the types of issues that need to shape the APSS. It is not meant to be definitive. It needs more work, but it shows the importance of integrating elements into a proper national security, and that defence is only one component of it. Defence strategy and national security strategy are not the same. Many countries have a national security strategy, and they differ depending on geography, threats, national priorities, and circumstances. All our Five Eyes partner countries, except Australia, have a national security strategy. At the Australian Peace and Security Forum, we think it important to include the word peace in the title because that always reminds us of the end state we are seeking. Nor do we think that an Australian peace and security strategy can be decided by a few parliamentarians and senior bureaucrats. That's what they did with the recent Defence Strategy Review, called for submissions and ignored them all. It must reflect genuine consultation with the Australian people and be debated in Parliament before approval by Cabinet Committee. The future security of our people and our country is too important not to do this. Thank you for your attention.
And thank you, Mike. Thank you for this clear call. Those 5 points will be, of course, in the recording. People will be able to see those again in the recording that will be put up on a website. I know I can see in the comments that people are wishing to see those 5 points again. We'd like now to go to the opportunity to field some questions that have been coming in. I'll do my best to summarize some of those in the time remaining. First to Melissa, I think what I'd like to do is combine several questions into one here. The sentiment being raised here is, what is the best argument that could be put to Labor to sign the TPNW before the next election? How do we get Albanese to listen, and what can the community do? How would you respond to that, Melissa?
Yes, well, I think it's important to remind Labor that this is one of their commitments in the national platform that's been there for years now, and to say, if not now, then when? I think it's also important to remind Labor that they won't be in government forever, and what a coalition government might do in this field. There've already been, I heard, some Liberal members of the Liberal Party talking about, that it's just a simple step from developing nuclear energy to developing nuclear weapons. And of course, they were shut down quite quickly, but that thought has been out there. And of course, it is the same process and the same materials to make nuclear energy as to make nuclear weapons. So joining the TPNW would be, putting in place guardrails against that happening for any future government to go down that path. I think talking to Labor MPs about the commitments they've made in their platform, talking to the Independents and the Greens who have already expressed support for the TPNW, and making them know that this has got to be a priority for them in the next term of Parliament, if not this one, that they need to put pressure on whichever government is in power to action this. ICAN is a civil society movement. It's global, but it was started in Australia. It started in Australia by a small group of people sitting around the kitchen table in Melbourne, asking themselves what they could do to rid the world of the world's worst weapons. And they decided to start a campaign based on the lines of the successful campaigns to ban landmines and cluster munitions. You make the weapons illegal and they become morally and legally unacceptable to use. And we work with governments, with got more than 700 partner organisations around the world, with communities impacted by nuclear weapons use and testing, with parliamentarians, even including in nuclear states and in nuclear allied states, with cities all over the world, and with financial institutions to work to put pressure on governments to join the treaty. So there's many ways people can get involved in this. We can all do something. We can all look at our banks and pension funds and superannuation funds and universities and see what their investment policies are. Do they invest in nuclear weapons? It was recently made known that the largest Australian superannuation fund, Australian Super, has investments in companies that make nuclear weapons. So we can all do something, and I mean that's the message we want to, get out to you now, that it's important to speak to your elected representatives. It's important to get involved. Every one of us doing something makes a difference. And I mean, nobody thought that we could get a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons adopted at the UN. We did. The author Yuval Noah Harari talks about the power of human imagination to redirect our ingenuity from self-destruction to self-creation. So we can do this. We can change the trajectory that we're on. We all do our part. I think I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you, Melissa. And I think everyone would like to thank you for doing your part in Geneva. So let me express that on behalf of the many compliments that are coming in to all of the speakers from our audience. Allan, one of the questions to you is, what neighbors can Australia rely upon in defense of our country? How would you respond to that?
I don't think we can rely on anybody because we can't rely on ourselves. We're not reliable. We're not reliable for our neighbours. We don't understand them. We don't know them. And one of the reasons we don't know them is that we don't know ourselves either. We have big problems with our own identity. We have big problems with what we stand for. We have big problems with what we want in the world. We seem to like to limit it to wanting what the United States wants. rather than saying to the United States, hey, there are a few things that you really don't need, fellas, and some of the things that we might like to do actually do fit much better into a peaceful world than some of the things you guys like to do. I don't think at this point, Penny, that we have any idea about how to calibrate a regional diplomacy in such a way that we make a group of countries which are mutually interdependent. We don't speak their languages, we don't understand their cultures. We like their students to come here so that we can fleece them of their money, but we don't teach them much. And in all of this, we sort of sit at the bottom end of the world. We have no enemies much, and we don't have any friends, which is the title of the previous book I did during COVID. And I wasn't even depressed. So I just think that we've got a long, long way to go. Our fear of abandonment, as Mike said, our insecurity, our need for a protector, our inability to conquer the pathologies of race and misogyny, the inability to self-affirm, which I think also affects us. These are very big drawbacks. And if we can't get on top of those, we will find it very difficult to build the kinds of relationships with Indonesia, with the rest of ASEAN, and with the countries of North Asia, Japan, China, Korea. So, a bit glum, really.
Thank you, Allan. I have a question for Mike, and then in view of the time, I would like to just ask all three respondents to reply to one final question in as briefly as possible. But first, the question to Mike, which is, how do we engage with China from a position of strength, Mike?
You're on mute.
Mike, you're on silent.
Mike, we can't hear you. Is Mike still with us?
Oh, apologies for that.
There we go.
Yeah. No, well, we need to engage with China, but we shouldn't be saying, like, from a position of Caucasian strength. So I think that's a dangerous way to approach it. I think we need to, first of all, acknowledge what and acknowledge truthfully what China has achieved and what they are achieving for their country, the people of their country. It's quite amazing where they've come from and to, and really where they're heading. And so we have to recognise that they are now a major power, and we should treat them with the respect that a major power deserves. But that doesn't mean to say we kowtow to China or any country. As has often been said, in a two-horse race, always best bet on the one that's named self-interest. And so we have to know exactly what our priorities are. But there are many ways that we can work with China on many issues. I've been disappointed with the way we've approached the Southwest Pacific, referring to them as the Pacific family and and that we are their partner of choice. They can say that if they want to. That's not for us to say. And we seem to be so worried about China coming in and assisting countries in the South Pacific. Well, of course, we don't want them to establish military bases, so we should talk to them about that. But I've seen what Timor has done by engaging with China and how much China has assisted Timor-Leste in their development role. And so there's a role for China in this world. And there'll be a greater role if President Trump goes ahead with cancelling the foreign aid, the US aid program and the Global Fund, because there's going to be a lot of people in the world and in our part of the world as well that are going to be left high and dry. Now, that's a place China might decide to go with their Belt and Road Initiative. I don't know. Anyway, I don't have a simple answer to that question, but there's more that we could be doing. And I fully agree with Allan's comment that we need to do more on cultural awareness. We were doing a lot on sister city relationships. I don't know where that's gone now, but they're the mechanisms that we need to build.
Thank you, Mike. Now, the question that I was going to put to all of you, and I think that in a way, Mike has already provided one answer to that, so I'll take that as his answer, which is, you know, when AUKUS was agreed, a second Trump administration was a possibility, but it wasn't a reality. Now it is. And so one of the questions we have is, how does that change the perhaps in a positive sense, how does that change the opportunities for what Australia could now do? So I'll put that question to you, Melissa, and to you, Allan. While you're thinking about that for 60 seconds, let me just remind people that these talks will appear on the APSF website, where you can also find more information on this and other matters that the Australian Peace and Security Forum addresses. And we'd also like to ask you to follow us on social media. Now, Melissa and Allan, what would be your 1 to 2 sentence response about whether or not the new administration in the US might provide Australia with new opportunities, time to do things in a different way? Melissa.
Thanks, Penny. Okay, quickly, Trump, yes, promises to be a period of increased chaos and confusion and total unpredictability. But there's also opportunity in that. There's opportunities because Trump has been talking about denuclearization with China and with Russia. This is positive. Previous presidents have not done that in recent times. So this is something that we need to, we need to be conscious of and prepared to capitalise on where we can, that there can be some good aspects of this. The other thing I would say is that we should not set anything we do by what's going on in other countries. We need to decide for ourselves. We need to be our own government, governing ourselves in this. And I think Mike and Allan have said it very well. We need to have our own sense of independence and know what our own interests are, rather than setting our sights depending on what other countries are doing and who's leading them.
Thank you, Melissa. Allan. Any opportunities in the current US administration?
Okay, I was having difficulty connecting myself back with the voice. Look, I agree with Melissa. The Trump presidency, I think, offers Australia remarkable opportunities if only we had the courage to put our arms around them and accept them. So I want to answer your question by saying how I would have written the Prime Minister's talking points for his first conversation with Trump. Now, for those of you who followed what the Prime Minister said after his conversation with Trump, he said, "Congratulations on becoming president. Australia has been a security ally of the United States for 80 years, and boy, oh boy, do we need those AUKUS submarines." So there were 3 elements in the Prime Minister's talking points, and they were all bullshit. My 3 elements would have been, you are now the President of the United States. I wouldn't have congratulated him, and nor would I have congratulated the United States. I would have made a statement of fact. My second point would have been, you lead the free world because the United States has positioned itself to be the leader of the free world. That is a very onerous responsibility. And in shouldering that responsibility, you do have our support. Because what it involves, Mr. President, is that you have got to represent the fundamental values that make us the free world: the dignity of the human person, the rule of law, and inclusiveness of everybody, irrespective of gender, race, ethnicity, or whatever else. And in doing all those things, Mr. President, you've got an ally that is 100% behind you. That's my answer.
Excellent, Allan. Fantastic. Great place to end the webinar. And may in future you be a speechwriter for the Prime Minister of Australia. We welcome new
I think he's not bright enough to engage me for that task.
We welcome new members to APSF, and everyone is also welcome to these monthly webinars, the next of which will be, people, Tuesday, 18 March, on constructive regional engagement with China. We hope to see you then, and until then, I wish you a very good evening. Thank you.